So, the first point. So what about technology, right? I put in briefly the targets of SDG 2. It's, we don't need to go into this in detail, but what strikes me is that a lot of these targets are actually, let's say, technical measures. So, for instance, 2.3, by 2030, double the agricultural productivity and incomes of small-scale food producers, in particular women, indigenous people, family. Okay, we know all that. Double the agricultural productivity. So this is about agricultural output, right? By 2030, 2.4, ensure sustainable food production systems and implement resilient agricultural practices that increase productivity and production, that help maintain ecosystems, strengthen capacity for adaptation to climate change, extreme weather, and so on and so forth, right? I'm just showing you this because I need them for the following point. We do not need to know all this or remember this particularly. 2.A, increase investment, including through enhanced international cooperation, rural infrastructure, agricultural research and extension services, technology development, plant and livestock gene banks to enhance agricultural productivity. 2.B, correct and prevent trade restrictions and distortions in world agricultural markets. I think that's something you, the law student from Australia, partly mentioned, right? Big systems that prevent certain change. 2.C, adopt measures to ensure the proper functioning of food commodity markets and their derivatives and facilitate timely access to blah, blah, blah. Well, so this is a technological take, largely, not complete, also an institutional one maybe, to say if we can enlarge the amount of food, or if we can enlarge the infrastructure to make more food, if we can have more people make more better food, we can solve world hunger. And it is, it's an incredibly relevant, let's say, take, but it is also a problematic take. Largely based on the picture I just showed you, right? And why that is relevant, or why that is interesting, is that we have experiences with these sorts of things that we just read. All these things, all these technological or institutional or educational issues have been tried before, and one good example is particularly the Green Revolution. And the Green Revolution can be understood as a science-based agricultural intervention that emerged, that originates from the, let's say, the end of the first half of the last century, in which academic institutions, agricultural scientists, particularly known for this Norman Borlaug, started to experiment with new varieties, stronger crops that were suitable for particular environments, trying to advocate or educate farmers with the use of fertilizers, to educate them in growth cycles, to use irrigation for fields that were not suitable for planting, and thereby, combined with better infrastructure, this led to worldwide a notable increase of agricultural yields, right? So one example, this is like a graph of wheat yields in developing countries between 1950 and 2004. You see there's a clear upward trend here, right? So the Green Revolution is a name that catches how science-based agriculture revolutionized a lot of small-scale farming across the world, also impacted on agricultural policies and politics worldwide. An example to show the extent of this is this one. Mexican wheat yields from 750 kilograms per hectare in 1945 grew to 1370 kilograms in 1956, right? That's quite a big difference happening there. And the imports of wheat into Mexico, right, was between 196,000 to 178,000 tons, was overturned into an export facility. So Mexico actually started to export wheat on the basis of the, let's say, agricultural overhaul of this particular variety worldwide. So this is an example by which, with hindsight, we could say already early, right, 1963, this green revolution was a success. It worked. But I just showed you the graph in the first half, right? We can pinpoint Mexico there. Maybe we can flip back. Let's see. Right. This is Guatemala. So Mexico is actually green. It attained halving that food security. Here it's actually not hungry in that regard on this graph anymore. So we could say, maybe we could assume, or maybe we could reason that in that particular case, the Green Revolution worked quite well in the, let's say, understanding of producing more food to feed more people. But on the same graph, we see that in sub-Saharan Africa, SSA, it largely failed. So now we can also criticize, right, the science-based agricultural interventions. What do we know from the recent past, or maybe the long-term past, in that, let's say, purely educational, scientific, technological, infrastructural intervention may actually not solve the case at all. In some cases, even worsen it. If you read up on the Green Revolution, in particular areas, it increased inequality, or it increased particular problems also. So this graph, just, you know, for a very quick reference, you see in Latin America, the Green Revolution is deemed a success. You see everything rising, right? The red one is wheat, the yellow one is maize, the gray one is roots. Asia, a little bit the same, but there we see this particularity of an immense population that also has grown quite considerably in the similar time lapse. So there is a surge in produce, but there is also a surge in population, so it balances out a little bit. The Middle East and North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa lags behind that. There is growth, right? But as we see later, some of that population growth that is there now dwarfs that growth also. But there is also an objective measure of a green revolution that did not take off in Sub-Saharan Africa, right? Let's say from a large perspective, as it did in other areas. Now, largely this is attributed to things that have not so much to do with technology per se, but more with, for instance, the local communities or local policies or local societies that were not able to link up to either this science-based intention, right? You need to have a certain level of education to take up an agricultural course. You need to be able to read and write in order to be trained in these facets. There needs to be an infrastructure in order to drive around fertilizer and so on and so forth. So the main analysis is if infrastructure, local politics, in a general sense, the let's say situation of local communities did not fit the techno fix that the Green Revolution was, as it did in other regions in the world. I hope you see I'm going with very big leaps through some of these topics, right? There is something to bring in against this also. But that is one. Another note was that most of the crops that were that were strengthened in this green revolution drive were not the crops that were so much part of the diet in Sub-Saharan Africa. For instance, millet was not a variety that Norman Borlaug sought to better or sought to change. So wheat maybe was less applicable to Sub-Saharan Africa as was rice, for instance. But this is interesting. What can we learn from what went wrong here, or what made that a technological input did not take off here as it did in Latin America and large parts of Asia? And for that we probably need to have a short look at Amartya Sen. He is the main scholar credited with a different narrative or discourse on hunger, right? So we go from hunger in a more crisis-like facility or understanding. And what he said, hunger is not a matter of there not being enough food, it's basically the matter of not having enough access to food, right? Starvation is a matter of some people not having enough food to eat, and not a matter of there not being enough food to eat. So what he says, this is much more about poverty. And it is the very same underlying background, like a societal or a sociological or a political context, that in his example creates a food crisis or creates a famine that in the case of the previous slides makes that a certain technological revolution does not work because it's about other stuff, it's about social stuff or it's about the political stuff. And he's an interesting guy because he studied big famines in Bengal, in Ethiopia, in later Bangladesh, and he found out that actually during these famines there was not an absolute decline in food, right? We call it food availability decline, but he said actually that was not necessarily or fundamentally or solely the cause of these crises. Rather, these crises were caused by that food that was there actually not reaching the people that were at that very moment in need of it. This is his famous book, Development as Freedom, and one of the things he advocates for is that actually when there's a functioning democracy, if leaders are held accountable for what they do not allow for their citizens, if they can be voted out, right, then leaders will make sure that food may reach them in times of need. But you can expand this notion and say, then leaders may make sure that infrastructure is in place, that education is around, right? So that I'm putting it a little bit harshly, but the underlying idea that in sub-Saharan Africa the Green Revolution did not take place can be seen as a result of societies that were not willing to particularly link up to the potentiality of the Green Revolution. And that is something that needs to be addressed when we talk about the Green Revolution 2.0, what many people do. They say if we want to solve world hunger, if we want to look at a credible SDG 2, then we need to do over the Green Revolution in sub-Saharan Africa particularly, because that is the main hunger belt. But then how do we go about this? What have we learned here? Are we willing to openly address that? Are we willing to sort of openly discuss that maybe it has something to do with this and not food availability, like poverty that makes that people can buy it, or that markets don't go there, or governments that simply don't take their citizens seriously enough, right? That would be something that we can talk about with the success and fallacy of techno-fix. By staring blindly towards technological solutions, we may neglect all that other stuff that Amartya Sen and others talk about.